And now I'm going to introduce Erik Preminger. He is the son, as many of you may know, of American burlesque queen Gypsy Rose Lee and noted filmmaker Otto Preminger. He spent his childhood by his mother's side as she performed her striptease comedy act in nightclubs and theaters around the world. He met his father only at the age of 22 and worked for him for several years, contributing to several of Preminger's films, including Skidoo with Jackie Gleason and Groucho Marx, Tell Me That You Love Me, Junie Moon with Liza Minnelli, and Such Good Friends with Diane Carroll. He is also the best-selling author of the memoir Gypsy and Me, At Home and on the Road with Gypsy Rose Lee, which was later retitled My G-String Mother. For several years, he was the entertainment producer on KGO's TV live morning talk show, AM San Francisco, where his weekly segment of celebrity interviews and movie criticism, Preminger's Picks, generated a huge amount of audience interest and was extremely popular. He is an Emmy award-winning television producer and made a documentary about his mother's career, which often was shown when Gypsy toured the country over the years. And now it is our pleasure to thank Erik Preminger for joining us this evening. Erik?
Oh my, I don't know. I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, but thank you. Anyway, I feel like I should be thanking you for this opportunity to talk about my father. I don't get this opportunity very much, and I've been really looking forward to it. Somebody has reminded me that somewhere it said that he was German, and the first thing I have to do is correct that. He was Austrian from Vienna. And given the topic of this whole series, I thought I might start by telling you how a 28-year-old Austrian man got invited to Hollywood when he didn't even know how to speak English. Otto was very fortunate in his life in that he discovered his passion at a very young age. He had a heart murmur. So while the other kids were out playing sports, he was inside reading and reading and reading. And he had a facility for memorizing things. So he was also reciting, acting out plays, all of that, to the point where he would drive his family crazy. Now, when he was 16, he read that Max Reinhardt, the most celebrated showman of his time in the German-speaking world, was going to open up a theater in Vienna. And he wrote a letter asking for an audition. And eventually he got the audition, but then of course he had to tell his father that he wanted to become an actor. And his father, who was very indulgent, said, go ahead, become an actor, but get yourself a real job too. So he provided a tutor, and Otto studied for and passed the law boards for Austria. At the same time, he was first working for Max Reinhardt, then off on his own in Czechoslovakia, different theaters all over the area, eventually coming back and replacing Max Reinhardt at his own theater. And it was about this time that in Hollywood, Daryl Zanuck was starting a new studio with Joseph Skank. And they needed talent. And so they came to the States, to Vienna, and had heard about Otto and offered him a contract. And he immediately accepted. His family was dead set against him going. They didn't understand how somebody with such a promising career in Austria could possibly give it up to go be in Hollywood, which was not exactly kosher, let's say. But he went, And Zanuck welcomed him with open arms, gave him, first allowed him to watch a movie being made, then gave him a couple B pictures to make, and then assigned him the biggest picture of the year for Fox. It was Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. And Zanuck himself had written the script. It was his baby. Otto, on the other hand, didn't know from Scotland, didn't know from any of the people, and didn't want to do the project. But when you worked for the studios, you had to do as you were told. So he did it, did a half-hearted job, and had a huge fight with Zanuck, who fired him, and actually fired him from Fox. Now, he still had a few months to go in his contract, so he hung around the lot, not doing anything. They took away his office, gave him his parking lot spot way out in Siberia, made him no more executive dining room, but he waited it out and then returned to New York to make plays. Now, this was around the time of World War II. And among other things, Broadway needed actors to play Nazis. And Otto was perfect for that part. Some might say he was typecast, but we'll talk about that later. At any rate, he did a number of plays, I think 17, while he was over 5 years in New York, including a play called Margin for Error. And he played a Nazi in this. And a few years later, Bill Getz was running Fox for Zanuck, who was in fighting the war, and wanted Otto to reprise his role as the Nazi. But Otto wanted to direct it too. And although he was reluctant, Zanuck finally allowed Otto to direct the picture, liked it, and gave Otto a contract as a producer, because Zanuck had still said no directing. So as a producer, Otto developed a number of projects, among them a film called Laura. And when Zanuck got back from the war, he told Otto that he liked the project and was assigning Ruben Mamoulian to direct. Could not have been a worse choice for directing a film noir, but Otto went along as he had to. He wasn't going to get fired a second time. And after 2 weeks or so, Zanuck called Otto to his office and said, "What do you think of the Russians?" And Otto said, "They're terrible." And Zanuck said, "I agree, you can direct the movie," which is how Otto got back to directing at Fox. But the story of Laura goes on from there, because when he finished the picture and showed it to Zanuck, Zanuck said, "Great picture, but a lousy ending." And he then dictated a new ending, which Otto had to shoot. When he came to screen the new picture, just by chance, in the audience, not the audience, but in the screening room, was a friend of Zanuck's named Walter Winchell, who was probably the most influential columnist in the United States at the time, and a good friend of Zanuck's. And at the end of the screening, Zanuck turned to Winchell and said, "How'd you like the movie?" And Winchell said, "Love the movie, lousy ending." So Zanuck then turned around and told Otto he could put his ending back on the picture. And that is really what established Otto as a director in Hollywood. He went on to make many movies in what he called the sausage factory. And then in the early 50s, the whole Hollywood establishment was shaken up when the studios had to get rid of their theaters. Until now, they own the theaters, so you had to work for them, make their pictures because they'd be shown in their theaters. Now they had to sell their theaters, and there was room for independent productions. And Otto was one of the first to jump on that bandwagon, and one of the first to start a long-time feud with censorship of all kinds. It started with his first movie, which was called The Moon is Blue. In it, there was a line, virgin. And the Catholic Legion of Decency said, no, cut that word out. And Otto, because he wouldn't listen to anybody, refused. So all at Sunday services, all the parishioners had to listen to the priest tell them, do not see the moon is blue, which made it a huge hit. And again, pushed Otto's career forward even more. After Moon is Blue, he made two Black musicals, opera. It's hard to know what to call them. One was Porgy and Bess, and one was Carmen Jones. Now, I mention these because subsequently I have run into both Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and both of them pulled me aside and told me how grateful they were for the opportunities that Otto gave them. And it was, I cannot tell you how nice it is to have people you admire tell you that they admired and liked your father. That was a wonderful experience. Okay, but back to my little story about censorship. Otto's next movie was Man with a Golden Arm, about drug addiction. This time, he ran into a problem with the motion picture censors because you weren't allowed to do a film about drugs. Once again, Otto thumbed his nose at them, made the movie, released it, and it was a great success. Both of those films were instrumental in defeating censorship in the United States. He then went on a few years later and made Exodus and decided that he wanted to hire Dalton Trumbo to write it. Well, a lot of movie makers, filmmakers, hired blacklisted writers, but Otto was the first to give them credit. And as a result, it was really the beginning of the end of the Hollywood blacklist. And those are really amazing accomplishments. And I don't think that he set out in his life to do those things. It was just he didn't like being told what he could and could not say or do. A couple of words about how Otto worked when he made films. He bought books, and then he would develop screenplays with writers on those books. And usually he would work with the writers at night after shooting a film during the day. So he was always like doing a script for a film, release the film, then shoot that one, start working on the next one. And it was just one after another. When he was working on Bunny Lake is Missing for the last time, he was shooting In Harm's Way, which was this huge, naval epic with ships blowing up and John Wayne, Kirk Douglas. I mean, it was a big, big thing. And here he is at night, he'd finish shooting, and then he'd go back to his hotel and work with John and Penelope Mortimer on the script for Bunny Lake is Missing. I think that's a pretty amazing that he could have that sense of concentration. John and Penelope Mortimer, however, were not the first writers on this. This was the longest gestation period of any film of Otto's. It took him 5 writers before he got a script that he considered acceptable. And I'm talking Dalton Trumbo, Walter Newman, who wrote Man with a Golden Arm, Ira Levin, who went on to write Rosemary's Baby. I mean, top writers, but they couldn't give him a script that satisfied him. I don't know what the scripts were like. I haven't seen them. And Penelope Mortimer came up with the ending, which was having the brother be the heavy. Now, I don't know what you might think of Keir Dulley's performance in this film, but I guarantee you that one person who loathed it was Keir Dulley. I have never read anybody write more scathing comments about working with Otto than Keir Dulley. And the reason for it is because Otto very often, when he got frustrated on a picture, would find, I guess you'd call it a whipping boy. And that person would get yelled at, screamed at, insulted in front of the cast and crew for the entire duration of a picture. It happened to Tom Tryon on The Carnival, and it happened to Keir Dulley on Buddy Lake is Missing. So certainly that would have had an effect on his work. Now, not everybody who worked with Otto was subject to that kind of treatment on occasion. Only a few people were lucky enough to have it happen the whole film. But even I, who worked with him, got yelled at on a number of occasions, and I can tell you it was not fun. However, he forgot it as soon as it was over. And then he turned into probably the most generous, loving, wonderful father I could have hoped for. So I guess that's what you got to do. Anyway, that's what I have to say to you for tonight. And I hope you have some questions.
Thank you. Everyone, again, please write down your questions in the chat function. So let me ask you something a little personal. How did you connect to your father since you didn't know him as you were growing up as a boy?
Well, actually, when this is a difficult story to condense, but basically, the man who I thought was my father, whose name was on my birth certificate, told me that he was not my father. I then went to my mother, who told me that it was Otto, but that I was never to contact him unless he contacted me. I agreed to that, but she didn't say I couldn't tell other people that he was my father, which I did. And he eventually heard that I knew and got my mother's permission to contact me while I was in the Army. And we met in Paris. He was doing publicity for Hurry Sundown. And this is something that is always touching for me. I was living on an Army salary, and I had only this very ratty raincoat, which I didn't wear when I walked into the suite to meet him. And we said hello, and he said, "Let's take a walk. I don't love to walk." And he pointed to me and he said, "Do you want your coat?" And I was too embarrassed to wear the coat, so I said, "I don't need a coat." And Otto's wife said, "Otto, do you want your coat?" And he said, "If my son doesn't need a coat, I don't need a coat."
We have some pictures that you picked out. Should we go through them now?
If you
Eric?
want.
Sure. And maybe you could comment on them. So Neely,
well,
why
okay.
don't we start?
This is Otto as a young man in Vienna, a successful theatrical producer at 28. Pretty impressive. It was around this time that he went. Somebody told him that if he had all his hair cut off, it would grow back, but it didn't. So subsequently to this, he was bald. The next picture, which of course is Otto in, I think this is Margin for Error. And you can see he makes a great Nazi. It paid the bills. So it was, he was happy to do it. As he said, he would have starved if it hadn't been for Hitler. These are just a couple of the posters for those two movies, Margin for Error. That's Milton Berle over in the lower right-hand corner.
Whoa.
And Laura, which, as I've just said, is probably the picture that made Otto's career. Certainly started it off.
Next picture.
And here we are working together. this, he's not yelling at me here, so I'm happy to say. And he certainly isn't yelling to me here.
What was his relationship to Judaism, as we asked for more questions?
Oh, well, it was non-existent. It's funny, his grandfather on his father's side was a Talmudic scholar. His father, who was a lawyer and was one of the only Jews to serve in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They asked him to convert, he wouldn't, and they gave him the job anyway, which I think inspired Otto when it came to his being asked the same question. As far as I know, Otto never went to shul, but his love of Jews and Israel cannot be denied. I mean, he was a fervent Zionist, and as you could tell from Exodus, and he often wanted to make a bio of Moshe Dayan, and worked on that for many years, but it never came to fruition.
Someone asks, which film directors did your father most admire? Besides himself.
I guess Kazan was probably, when I was working for Otto, he wanted me to be a director, which was an unfortunate choice, but he then said you should work for somebody whose total style is totally different from mine, and actually asked Kazan if he would let me work with him on his next film. It never happened, but I would have to say then that Kazan was probably his favorite director.
What do you think was his best movie, and what did he think was his best movie?
Otto never thought about his movies once he finished them. Sometimes I think he didn't even remember them. When he finished the movie, he would go on the road and publicize it, and then it was done. He never thought of it again, and I don't think he even cared about them again, unless somebody tried to edit them for television, of course, and then he did. I couldn't say what's my favorite picture of Otto's, because I've seen not all of them by far, and it's too wrapped up in emotion for me to be able to really judge them.
In Bunny Lake is Missing, of course, the police inspector in England is Laurence Olivier. What was his relationship to the great one?
I think Otto loved working with good actors. And when I say that, it's not to diminish the actors who, other actors, but a professional actor, somebody of that ability to come in, letter perfect all the time, do the role, give it the nuance that he could give it. I thought, I never heard Otto say anything about it, but I'm sure it was, and what I've read about it was a very cordial relationship.
A question from someone. Were you taken to Otto Preminger films as a child? And what did you think of them at the time before you really knew he was your father? or even afterwards?
I must tell you a very funny story. I'm walking down the street with my mother. I guess I was about 8 years old. And I still remember, I saw this big billboard for Man with a Golden Arm. And it was Saul Bass did all his titles, or most of them, and the graphic was very impressive. And I said, "Oh, can we go see that?" And she said, "Erik, that's not a movie for children." So I actually, in all fairness, when I learned that Otto was my father, I really didn't even know who he was. My background was nightclubs, yeah, basically nightclubs. And uh, the the legend in my house was Mike Todd, who was, a showman of a different ilk. I actually suspected that he was my father when I first found out that it wasn't Bill Kirkland. But then my mother said it was Otto Preminger, and it took me years to find out more and more and more about him.
Okay. Did your father lose any relatives in the Holocaust, since I presume many of his relatives stayed in Europe?
That's a wonderful story. His family, his brother and his father and mother, managed to get to Switzerland before Hitler made it impossible to leave Austria, but they couldn't get a visa to come to the States. And Otto had directed Tallulah Bankhead, and he told her about the difficulties he was having. And she arranged for her, I think it was her uncle, who was a member of the House of Representatives, to pass a special immigration bill so that they'd be allowed to get into the country. He always spoke so highly of her for that. What a wonderful thing she did.
I think the answer is probably no, but we'll ask it. Did your parents ever work together?
No.
Before you were born, or no?
No, as a matter of fact, when I thought about it, when I thought about the two of them being together with me sort of in the middle, I felt like I would have ended up a pancake. No, my mother claimed that the relationship was solely because she wanted to have a child. And Otto was between marriages at the time and had cast quite a net over the women of Hollywood. And I'm sure my mother was just another date, if you will. But for her, it was to be, she actually said, he was very intelligent and very successful, and I wanted those traits to be inherited by my child. So that was her rationale.
You mentioned, or I mentioned when I read your brief bio, that you worked on several films. What did you do, and which was your favorite? And certainly they had very famous celebrities in the starring roles.
Well, yeah, the movies weren't great. And I might as well tell you right now that the movie I wrote for him made the New York Times 10 worst pictures of the year. So we can get that out of the way right now. Again, for me, when we did Skidoo, for example, which was a misplaced movie and made for different reasons, and it had a whole bunch of hippies in it, one of my jobs was to take a bus up to Topanga Canyon at 4:00 in the morning and collect hippies for the hippie armada that ended the movie. And they had to be in costume, and it was good if they had a dog. So that was one of my jobs. And eventually, mostly casting for his films. But again, Otto made his movies. The most that I could do or that anybody could do was to bring him options, and he would make the choices. The movie that probably was most instrumental for me was Such Good Friends, because in searching for a writer for this, had gone through, Joan Didion had written the script, and she decided to go back to California. It wasn't going well. And eventually we got Elaine May to write the final script. And Elaine, it's so funny. As I said, Otto liked to work very closely with writers. So with Elaine, they had a story conference, and he went over the first couple scenes of the picture and sent her off to write those scenes and said, I'll see you. This was like Friday. I'll see you on Monday. And on Monday, no word from Elaine, and Tuesday and Wednesday. I mean, Elaine was not available for anything. And then after about a week, she shows up with the first third of the script, ready to go, puts it on his desk. So he couldn't say anything except go write the second half or the second third. Later on, I became very friendly with Elaine and was pleased to work with her on The Heartbreak Kid. And that was a fabulous experience. She is probably one of the most influential people that I've ever worked with. And so that came out of working with Otto too.
And certainly her version was many, many times better than the remake of the same plot line. Any more questions from people? Let me ask you, he worked in many genres, and a lot of things are available on Amazon Prime or Infinite. There may not be an Otto Preminger retrospective, though I would love to do it, but it's hard to get streaming rights to a lot of the films. But if you said, these are the 5 films that represent Otto's creativity and his genius, what would you say that people should try to hunt down on on streaming?
Well, the Criterion Collection has 3 of his Fox film noirs. Laura, you can't look at Otto's work without Laura.
I love that film.
I think that you have to, Anatomy of a Murder is possibly one of his, if not his best movie. Exodus, which, if only for the canvas, is, and it was the first film that was actually shown in theaters with reserved seats. And I think that's a very good movie to see. Those are my 3 favorite movies of his. And I'd leave it probably at that.
Okay. I know that he was so brave in writing Dalton Trumbo as a screenwriter for Exodus, but there's a controversy, maybe you know the answer. Kirk Douglas also named Dalton Trumbo as Dalton Trumbo and not an alias for Spartacus. Who did it first? Was it your father or Kirk Douglas?
This was before my time with Otto. So I can't say. I think it's interesting because they both claimed they were first. And Kirk Douglas worked with Otto after this discussion when in harm's way. So he can't have held a grudge about the debate. I think it was probably Otto. I know that when I worked with Otto, Dalton Trumbo was at the office frequently. And they were very, very close. A lot of these stories, I should tell you, Otto had in his office in New York, when I knew him, this huge marble slab as a desk. It must have been at 3 feet across and maybe 10 feet long, solid slab of marble on 2 chrome pillars. And every day at 5 o'clock, it was an open door invitation. And Dalton Trumbo would stop by if he was in town. Sometimes there was a Catholic priest that Otto knew who was an artist who had hit Otto up for money one time on the street. And Otto would give $100 to almost anybody who asked for money. and collected a number of very interesting characters that way. Anyway, that's where I've heard these stories from, a lot of them.
There was a film, someone asked, there was a film, not a documentary, but a feature film about Dalton Trumbo recently that showed your father in it, approaching him about the movie Exodus. Did you like the person who was cast in that film?
Well, you know, that's so hard to say. I love the fact that his role was there. You know, that they gave him his due. The actor wasn't bad, you know, and again, I was just so happy to see the character. I didn't really judge the performance. It's you know, I've seen my parents portrayed now a couple times, and it's always a strange experience because they're not the people I knew, but it's nice to see them there anyway.
If we can go to your late mother, what did you think of the play Gypsy?
Well, you know, I remember seeing the opening night in Philadelphia, out of town, when it ran for 3.5 hours. And every subsequent Class A production, and every time it makes me cry. It's aside, you know, from the fact that it is a brilliant piece of theater, it's also, my mother was a very smart woman, and when she wrote her memoir, Warner Brothers wanted to make it into a movie. And David Merrick, who was not the producer he later became, wanted to make it into a play, a musical. And she chose Merrick. And I asked her once why, and she said, because if this show is a hit, it will go on forever, and I will live forever. And that is so true. Nobody would know Gypsy Rose Lee today if it hadn't been for the musical.
And
So,
your aunt was also famous.
yeah, less so. And
Yeah. Do you want to say who she was? Because a lot of people.
June Havoc. And I saw her in something recently. I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been a movie that Otto made. It was very strange. But she was a very different kind of person. And frankly, I didn't get along very well with her. And so probably the less said, the better.
Okay, I won't comment any further. I really encourage everyone to see Laura, especially An Anatomy of a Murder. And if you can find a copy streaming, Bunny Lake is Missing. It's really, people saw it the other day at the Lafayette Library, which is Lafayette Library is a co-sponsor of this series, and really enjoyed it and was surprised by the ending if they hadn't already guessed it. What especially I loved about it, if people can see it, is the credits where a hand is pulling away the name, you know, the black cover, and you see the names underneath, as if you're discovering the secrets of the movie. Very well done, and introducing Carol Lindley and Keir Dullea in their early performances.
Did you know, that those credits, like the credits for most of Otto's independent films, were designed by Saul Bass, who was a great, probably the best graphic designer of his era, and a charming, wonderful man, who used to hang around the marble slab and listen to stories too. And yes, the titles on so many of Otto's films are just brilliant.
Anatomy of a Murder. And yes, they're very striking. They're very contemporary. And a lot of his films are feel contemporary, even though they're made several decades ago. Anyhow, Eric, go ahead.
Nope, nothing. I was just going to say, I agree with you, of course.
Okay. Really, and Laura is just wonderful. Anytime I see it on TV, because it does play from time to time, I will see it. Clifton Webb, and was it Dana Andrews? That especially feels very contemporary. Anyhow, thank you so much for your generosity of spirit, and everyone for joining us. And I hope to see everyone on Tuesday when Lynn Thorner deconstructs Sunset Boulevard by Billy Wilder. We're streaming it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You should get a link if you signed up, or if you are a major, pass holder to the festival. And Eric, I hope we'll see you in something else, and maybe I'll talk to you about doing something on Gypsy Rose Lee in the future.
All right. Listen, it's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Wonderful. And I hope your arm feels better, because I know it's in a cast. Anyhow, thank you, everyone. See you next time at the movies or a lecture from the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. Good night.